Welcome to EURACTIV interview series. I am Karolina Zbytniewska, editor-in-chief at EURACTIV Poland, and our guest today is Marc Lemaître, Director General for Regional and Urban Policy at the European Commission. And what is probably very important to mention, also the former chief cabinet of two Polish commissioners, Janusz Lewandowski and Danuta Hübner. So he is very fluent in cohesion, but also in the Polish dimension to cohesion. And as Marc writes on Twitter, also an unapologetically passionate European. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to be with you today. Allow me perhaps just to add the name of Paweł Semecki, who was also European Commissioner.
In between the two, yes.
With whom I also had the pleasure to work, and definitely well knowledgeable of Poland in Europe, not only of Poland and cohesion policy.
Of course, and just I wanted to mention that this is not a real deer, just a plastic lady deer on my wall there in the back. Okay, so let's get down to the most pressing topics at the moment. So it's not only coronavirus pandemic, but also how Europe takes this challenge, how we fight it, and how cohesion money and policy can be a solution. So the current crisis is said to be probably even worse than the 2009 breakdown. So could you tell me, what is the EU offering for the main member states and the citizens to address the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I would start with your premise that it's worse than the 2009 crisis. It is different. What we can indeed expect is that the immediate economic downturn will be deeper than back in 2009, and we start seeing it through the figures. But what is certainly not said is how we will recover from that. And there, and I'm sure we will elaborate on that today, things are not written, and a lot will depend on our collective response. And we do have, I believe, a fair chance, if our collective response is sufficiently courageous and decisive, to in fact recover much faster than back in 2009. You were asking what we are doing. I think we have mobilized ourselves on multiple fronts, and everywhere where we thought, and when I say we, it's the European Commission as initiating or pushing for certain collective actions, where we thought that acting together was definitely superior to acting alone. And there, the list is nearly endless, I would say, of initiatives which we have seized. Let's start with looking for a vaccine, right? We can do it together. Alone, it will take probably 10 times longer to ultimately achieve a vaccine. So we have put all the means we had through research means under the European budget in order to accelerate collective research efforts towards a vaccine. Secondly, we have tried to get member states, after a first response which was totally self-centered for each member state, and not thinking at all about the neighbors and the effects on them, we have tried to bring them progressively back towards the only winning formula, which is the one of, as I said, coordinated action. Think of border closures. Member states went for radical border closures, including Poland, stopping international flights and even internal flights, imposing quarantines, and so on and so forth. Was this legitimate from a pandemic point of view and fighting the pandemic point of view? I think it is doubtful, because the situation was more or less the same on one side of the border as on the other side of the border,
Yes, but it was
in most cases.
unprecedented, and everyone
Of
was
course,
doing what
all
they.
of this is unprecedented. I am not now saying that member states made grave mistakes and so on. I am not criticizing here. I am just indicating that these initial reflexes of member states um, were damaging, definitely seriously damaging, because they also led, and you know it, to enormous problems on the borders for the circulation of goods, for imports and exports. So basically, we were inflicting damage on ourselves because we had member states had these national reflexes and had not thought about a coordinated action. So now what we are seeing, and we definitely believe this is superior, is that at least when it comes now to lifting the border closures, that there is some coordination and that we are looking at the exact pandemic situation in the different member states, and that we are basing the decisions when there is a differentiation to be made between member states on objective risk factors. This is very important. What have we done when suddenly all these confinement measures were taken all across the world? We have, for instance, organized collective repatriation flights for EU citizens. There were more than 100,000 EU citizens who were stranded anywhere in the world. And again, you had perhaps in one place, I don't know, 5 Polish citizens, and you had 15 German citizens and 20 French citizens, and so on. And so the
Poland
only
was very late, very slow to join this mechanism.
Well, again, I am not commenting on that, but we offered it, and it was ultimately extremely successful because we managed in the most rational way and in the quickest way to organize the repatriation of all these EU citizens in the end. And we have, I think, in record time started to adjust rules so that member states could immediately try to take measures to stabilize the economic and social situation by loosening immediately any kind of state aid constraints which exist in normal times. This has allowed all member states to take very powerful measures of supporting, for instance, SMEs in order to avoid that they would run into immediate bankruptcy, to help also on wage costs so that companies would not lay off workers but would be helped in order to pay the wage bills. All of this has been done, I think, very, very fast. And clearly, what is now required is what is still a missing piece. It is to equip the EU itself with sufficient budgetary power in order to decisively shape the rebound I have talked about.
Okay, now let's turn to money. and maybe some numbers as well, because in Poland there was this kind of narrative promoted by the government. They have stopped that, but it was very present, that Poland actually hasn't received, and here is a quote, even an euro cent from the European Union. So how it was, this sentence complaint was developed was that we haven't received a euro cent because all the money that we've received was actually the money that we already had. Is it true? Did we really achieve no money, or gained no money? How was this recovery help procured for member states, for the regions, and for fighting the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I think you are touching on an absolutely vital point for the EU and for its future. And I would want to say very forcefully what I have to say on that. And it is that the future of the EU depends indeed on how we talk about the EU. And everyone there has a huge responsibility, and first and foremost, the national uh, political scene in each and every member state. We are not from Brussels disseminating propaganda in all the member states. So what citizens hear about the EU comes normally from the national politicians, from the national democratic debates, and of course from the national governments, the ministers who are speaking about Europe. And I emphasize this point of responsibility because it is clear that if member states always present positive public action as being thanks to them, and anything which is going slightly less well, etc., as being the fault of Brussels, foreign powers, whatever, the EU will be in trouble in the medium to long term. And we are seeing that. I mean, we are seeing because of permanent criticism of the EU in certain member states. In certain member states, you have the phenomenon of the so-called net payers, right? Where, let's take the Netherlands. Over decades in the Netherlands, everyone was saying that the EU was costing a lot, too much, and Netherlands should be paying less to the EU budget. Well, obviously, after 20 years,
approach.
No, not a frugal approach. I think frugal is too much of a neutral term. So to me, it is a stingy approach to Europe. It's not frugal. And obviously, after 20 years of hearing that, the huge majority in the Netherlands believes that all their taxes go to Brussels, which is obviously not the case at all. And on top of that, they suddenly, they have never been informed about the benefits of the EU and what the Netherlands gets out of the EU. And I am not talking about the EU budget. I am talking about benefits which are obviously about the Netherlands' prosperity ultimately, but which are also about the quality of life, about the freedoms of which we benefit, about the stability in Europe, about peace, about so many absolutely fundamental things. So I come back to the question of responsibility. I really think that the quote of yours demonstrates quite a bit of bias. I would not speak of fake news, but it is very biased to say that Poland would not receive any help from the EU. What does it mean? The money would be already Polish money. Poland receives out of cohesion policy in the present 2014-2020 period close to 2.5% of its GDP in transfers every year. This is something which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. The EU is unique in that, in offering that kind of redistributive solidarity mechanism between member states. So it is quite a remarkable setup. What has happened with the crisis is that basically we have, I would say, nearly thrown out the rule book. We have said, with that money, which normally you could have used only for certain very specific things, in order to promote the catching up process of Poland with the EU average, well, we accept collectively, and especially the ones who allow for these transfers, massive transfers to Poland, we accept collectively that there is a crisis and there is suddenly an immediate priority which should be taken care of, and we allow you to use that money in a different way from what it was originally meant to do. It is also, I think, a form of solidarity. And what we have seen, and we are very happy about that, is that Polish authorities at national and at regional level have seized on these new possibilities and have redirected very massively already cohesion funds from what they were meant to finance to immediate crisis fighting measures. In the health sector, more than 500 million euros, which again were not foreseen for immediate equipment to the health sector, for testing capacities, you name it, for respirators and so on. Secondly, SMEs. SME support in Poland is also being financed by European money. Thirdly, what I mentioned before, the support of wages to workers. Again, there has been some redirecting of funds towards that immediate need. And today, we are already at a redistribution of funds in the order of 3 billion euros, i.e. 13, 14 billion zlotys, which is not peanuts, I would suggest.
And would you say it's a free?
And we will not be we will not be stopping at that. I assume we will be spending a bit of time on our proposals to indeed have the budgetary capacity at European level in order to emerge collectively stronger from the crisis. And this will provide new money, which was not foreseen, and which was not foreseen up to a few months ago, which goes well beyond the normal level of the EU budget. My final point on this is that also when it comes to the communication on specific measures which national governments are taking, when there is a significant contribution from the EU to these national measures, I repeat, it's a question, I think, of honesty, but also a question of responsibility, collective responsibility towards the future of the EU. It would be normal to recognize that role. And to me, it is not about, half-heartedly recognizing that role. It is about saying, I am a proud member of the European family, and I love this partnership with Europe, because together we are stronger, and we are joining up our forces, Poland and European support together. So I think that everyone should see the merit in informing citizens correctly, and secondly, also in showing the power of being a proud member of the EU.
Just finishing up on this topic of this emergency redirecting of funds, because you mentioned that around 3 billion has been already spent, yes? And as far
Yes.
as I know, altogether there is more. There is 7.5 and 7.4 that is preserved in a way for Poland from this redirection of funds. So we still have
The potential for, yeah,
what
the
is the time
potential
that
for
we could use it?
the potential for further funding for crisis fighting measures is larger than that. So there is scope for going higher in that support. It rests on the national government and on regional authorities also when it comes to the regional programs to decide on that. But there is indeed some possibility for that, and we anticipate that yes, there will be much more money flowing into these areas of immediate support from cohesion policy, now that we have proposed, and we have very high hopes that this proposal will be approved, that we will in fact be topping up the means of cohesion policy in the coming 2 years, which would mean that additional money, new money, fresh money would be coming and would allow, without redirecting at all, but by a new decision to fund additional measures of this type.
How it is possible that Poland, that in comparison to some other member states, hasn't suffered from this pandemic, at least in terms of physical health, as much as the others? Also, according to the European Commission study, we won't have such a big, we will have actually the smallest slowdown out of all economic slowdown out of all the member states. So how come the help that we've already received, that we mentioned, this 3 billion out of 7.4 billion euros from redirection of funds, and how come the new recovery instrument are so treating Poland so well? We suffered less than others, but we are getting the most or almost the most. Why?
You are not talking like the Polish government here, clearly. We have tried to design an objective formula for distributing the means which we propose for the so-called recovery plan, which we call Next Generation EU. And I can also explain where this name comes from and what the philosophy of that name really is. So it is this plan which proposes to go beyond the normal level of the EU budget by 750 billion euros. So I would think in zloty, something like 3.5 billion zloty. Sorry, 3.5 trillion zloty, 3,500 billion zloty. This amount represents something like 5% of the EU's GDP. And we would distribute it overall on the 4 coming years, 2021, 22, 23, 24, in a decreasing way, which would mean that on average, we would be adding a budgetary stimulus at Central European level of more than 1% of the EU's GDP. So it is macroeconomically a very meaningful stimulus. To guide that stimulus, we foresee to reinforce certain existing policies and instruments, and notably cohesion policy. I have already mentioned about it, but we also foresee to create one huge new instrument called the Recovery and Resilience Facility. For these different instruments, we have proposed some distribution key between the member states, which differ depending on their specific function. If we take cohesion policy, which would be reinforced by 55 billion euros, those 55 billion euros will be distributed among the member states according to exactly the considerations you were suggesting. Mm-hmm. The magnitude of the economic and social shock to individual member states. Mm-hmm. So we will be looking at GDP loss in individual member states. And this is why we don't know yet the exact key today, because we will be waiting to get statistics in October, which will cover the whole first half of this year, to see the magnitude of the drop in individual member states at that point. We will also be looking at the increase in the unemployment rate to cover the social cost. And also youth unemployment. And we will take account something which is absolutely evident, I would say, the relative capacity of member states to react by themselves to the cost of this crisis. So this is to take account that some member states have weaker fiscal capacity than others, and that therefore we should exert a certain solidarity in their direction. So this is why we also take into account the prosperity criterion in order to determine that key. Now, our expectation is indeed that, because of what you have said, that Poland might very well be one of the member states ultimately suffering the softest decline in economic activity this year. This is why indeed Poland would not a priori be a huge beneficiary of these 55 billion. Then there is, of course, this prosperity criterion, which is favorable to a country like Poland, which today is at the level of slightly above now. I saw the latest figures, always in progress, good progress over the last years. Poland has now reached in 2019 73% of the EU average in terms of GDP per capita in purchasing power parities.
It is great, but it's still 73% of out of 100% when Germany is around 120, isn't it?
Um, well,
I
good
know we
remark.
started with 50,
Yes.
51,
So,
but
2003, 50, 51, more or less, yeah, around 50.
mhm.
And basically, 17 years later, you have made up nearly half of the gap with the EU average, right? Well, I don't know many, again, other regions in the world where you can have such catch-up processes in an organization in a grouping of states. This is the miracle of the EU. It is also the specific miracle, and this is what I really believe. The specific miracle which polls themselves have, of course, collectively produced. Absolutely, the first merit goes to the Polish people. Absolutely, because Poland has caught up in a much more impressive way than, for instance, Hungary. Compare the two. Hungary started at a much higher level than Poland in 2003. Well, now Poland, at least according to these macroeconomic figures, has surpassed Hungary,
A
has
little,
done much better. Sorry?
a little.
Yes, no, but you
Not
are
big.
ahead now of Hungary. You were never ahead of Hungary before.
Mhm.
So clearly, there are clear merits in Poland and in how well overall Poland has managed its economy. But I think that it is indeed uh, the the best demonstration of what the EU can produce in terms of very, very positive and rapid economic and social development. Back to your question, you were suggesting that Poland might be getting too much out of this recovery
No, no,
package.
no. I was just,
Well,
playing the devil's advocate
okay.
to achieve good, interesting answers.
Okay, well, to finish on the answer, when it comes to the cohesion part, yeah, the reinforcement to cohesion, you know, the present share of Poland in cohesion policy, which is enormous. It's nearly 25% of the whole cohesion policy budget in the present period.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to this 55 billion top up, we would be at a much, much lower share for Poland than 25%. And this is the reflection, yes, that we would be taking into account as a primary criterion the relative hit to individual member states by this crisis. I talked about this new huge instrument, which would be nearly as big as cohesion policy itself over the coming 4 years. 310 billion euros in 2021, 22, 23, 24. And cohesion policy in the coming period, um, at the present state of discussions, would amount to 323 billion. So it is nearly the same. Now, um, under that new instrument, which is meant to support reforms and at the same time investments in member states, that instrument is meant to take account of the structural weaknesses of member states and to help member states to overcome those structural weaknesses through investment and reform packages. So the logic of the distribution key for that instrument is a different one. It is not a logic of the impact of the crisis. It is a logic of long-term structural problems, ingrained problems in individual member states. therefore the distribution key is quite different, and one doesn't look at the latest development of the economy or at the latest development of the labor market, but rather at a persistent situation. And there, yes, the share of Poland would be in fact much more favorable than under this cohesion top-up. But even there, I would say the share of which Poland would benefit would be much smaller than under cohesion, than under normal cohesion.
Mm-hmm. If you can explain, because there are three numbers that reappear in Poland. So it was 37 billion euros for this emergency recovery aid to the member states, out of which Poland got 7.4. Then there is a European Commission new plan for the multi-annual financial framework of 1 trillion 1.1 trillion euros, plus there is the 750 billion euros of a recovery instrument. And now you were talking about 310 billion euros per year. So in which out of this compartment shall I distribute this 310? Is it 750 or 1.1 trillion or?
Let's simplify and start by the normal EU budget. The normal future EU budget, known as the multi-annual financial framework. This is the 1.1 trillion box. Now, in that 1.1 trillion box, you have the normal cohesion policy. And the normal cohesion policy, as I said, according to the present state of negotiation, it's not the final figure necessarily, would represent 323 billion.
Okay.
In that 323 billion normal cohesion policy, Poland can expect to get around 20% of that. So, you know, by far the biggest share of any member state. That's the normal EU budget for the future. Then we have the recovery plan, exceptional on top of the EU budget, 750 billion on top of the 1,100. Other box, temporary, exceptional measures. In that 750 billion, you have 500 billion of grants, meaning transfers to member states from the EU budget, just like under the normal EU budget. And you have 250 billion of loans. Now, the new instrument, which is called Recovery and Resilience Facility, would be endowed overall with 560 of the 750 billion. It is through that instrument that you would have the 250 billion of loans, only through that instrument. Yeah? And the rest of the 560, 310 would be grants. And this is what I compared with cohesion policy, because it's comparable. Cohesion policy is grants. And this new instrument, Recovery and Resilience Facility, would have 310 billion of grants. And because it is part of the recovery plan, all of that money, the 310 billion euros, would be allocated over just the first 4 years of the next period. So 2021, 2022, 3 and 4. while cohesion policy overall would run from 21 to 27 normally. So this is the explanation of the different figures. And then let me add that as part of the 750 billion, you have the 55 billion additional cohesion money, which I have talked about a while ago, which would come to reinforce the present cohesion policy, the one which is running right now, and which would therefore be fresh money indeed, and which would allow for funding crisis measures, crisis repair, and recovery measures over the coming 3 years, because all the money would have to be spent just like the present cohesion policy by the end of 2023. So that 55 billion is counted in the 500 billion of grants of the recovery plan.
Okay, thank you very much for this.
And so when it comes to Poland, you take cohesion policy in the present, Poland has a huge, nearly 1/4 share in that. For the future cohesion policy, because Poland has made so much progress also in converging, Poland, and much more progress than many others, Poland would get around 20% of the future cohesion policy.
So 1/5.
Yes, and when it comes to the recovery and resilience facility, the share of Poland there would be significantly lower. I don't remember exactly the figure, but it would be more like around 10% than around 20%.
Still allowed, taking their
Still allowed.
27 countries in the European Union.
Of course, it would still be a very significant, a very high net transfer towards Poland and net support to Poland. Absolutely, yes.
A question which wasn't planned. I'm wondering about Great Britain. It's we are after Brexit, but still it's this middle phase in between the membership and the full Brexit. And does it is it in a part of any of European Union aid packages?
No. And that is the result of the withdrawal agreement. So this divorce contract, which was agreed upon at the beginning of this year, and this foresees, when it comes to the EU budget, that the United Kingdom remains responsible to continue to finance its share of the EU budget for all the past commitments, including the normal multi-annual financial framework 2014-2020. So even for the new budgetary commitments in 2020, the UK will continue with delay and so on to pay its share of that. But it was also very clear that any new financial commitments which would be taken by the EU would not affect the United Kingdom. And not affect means the United Kingdom doesn't have to contribute to that collective financial effort, but cannot benefit from it either. So the UK is, let's say, not affected in any way by that, but not helped either in any way.
Coming back to the topic that you touched upon, not naming them with the name of inequality. So there are broad inequalities still within the European Union between the member states, and here cohesion policy comes in handy, but also between the regions. So I wanted to ask about the proportion of suffering of different regions in the European Union, and with a special focus on Polish regions.
I assume you are asking it in the context of the COVID crisis. It is today still difficult to assess exactly what the impact will be on the different member states. And it is even more difficult to anticipate what the potentially asymmetric effects will be within the member states on individual regions. But what we have clearly indicated also in our proposals for this additional support through cohesion policy
Mhm.
is that when member states decide on the allocation of that money, and that decision should come ideally if all political decisions are made by then, if there is an agreement on the EU budget, on this recovery plan, and so on, that decision of specific allocation within the member states would come ideally at the end of this year. And we expect, of course, that by the end of this year, we will have more clarity on the impact on regions also within the member states. And our uh, guidelines on that are that member states, for this new support under cohesion policy, should take account, one, of the relative impact on the different regions, and secondly, also intrinsically on the relative level of development of the different regions. So we would expect that everything else being equal,
Mhm.
Poland would concentrate more support on the Eastern Polish voivodeships than on the capital, to
Mhm.
speak plainly.
Mhm. Okay, I have a question coming back to the this reallocated money, the 37 billion euros for the EU and the 7.4 billion allocated reallocated for Poland. And I want to ask it in view of the question about how, in view of Polish membership already 16 years in the EU, how would you assess our spending and our exploitation of the cohesion policy? How good use we have made of it? You partly answered this question saying how much higher in the European rankings we are, but on the other hand, as far as I know, the 7.4 billion euros that we got for reallocation to face the crisis was the unallocated money. So in a way, we would lose it because we hadn't managed to use it on cohesion.
Hmm.
No.
No, this is not correct. Um, when we proposed these flexibilities, allowing to redirect not yet used money under cohesion policy, we were in March, April of this year, right?
Mhm.
We were theoretically in the last year of the present financial framework, which runs from 2014 to 2020. But um, cohesion policy rules uh, give until 3 years later to ultimately spend the money. So all member states, for their allocation, have until the end of 2023 to demonstrate that they have spent the money on cohesion projects. So clearly, in 2020, there is still plenty of time. And Poland was not at all, because Poland is also in this period a very good performer in implementing cohesion policy, was not at all at risk of losing any of its cohesion allocation. But what is also clear is that when you still have 3 years to spend, you haven't spent everything. And therefore, you still have some possibilities for redirecting funding. And this is exactly the amounts you have talked about. And in fact, in my assessment, these amounts are higher than what you have mentioned. So in my assessment, overall across the EU in cohesion policy, we have at least 50 billion of capacity to redirect money towards crisis fighting measures. And in the case of Poland, to me, it's also rather around 10 or even a bit more billion euros. But again, this should not be seen as a sign that the money wouldn't have been spent on time or of bad implementation, not at all. And returning to your more fundamental question, yes, I believe that Poland is, um, without exaggeration, a shining star of making the best use of cohesion policy in order to support its catching up process. Cohesion policy, of course, is not the sole reason for this catching up process. I said you need, a good overall economic policy framework, and Poland has had that. But certainly, cohesion policy, as demonstrated in Poland, can play a significant accelerating role in this catching up process. What has been the recipe of that success? I think it has been to find a good balance in terms of who is responsible for using those funds. And therefore, a good balance between, on the one hand, national programs which are managed by the national government, and regional programs which are managed by the regional authorities. Today, in the present programming period, we have, for the Regional Development Fund and for the Social Fund, which are the two main funds under cohesion policy, we have respectively 55% of the funding and 66% of the funding, which is managed at regional level. And we believe that this has significantly contributed to overall this very positive impact of cohesion policy, because there was a significant degree of decentralization and of decision making more at the regional and local level. And this is certainly something which we are promoting also for the future. We consider that this is an essential ingredient of the continued success of cohesion policy in Poland, also for the coming decade. One element, though, which two elements, I would say, which do require attention, is first, the relative lack of catching up compared to the Polish average of the 5 eastern Polish regions, despite having been supported significantly more since accession by cohesion policy than the other regions of Poland. So there, I think there is a need to analyze a bit what could be the causes of this relative lack of success, because these 5 eastern Polish regions are today at 50% of the EU average, more or less 50%, meaning they are today at the relative level at which Poland was when Poland acceded the European Union. So there has been no relative catch-up within Poland of these poorer parts of Poland, and I think that again this requires a bit of analysis to understand better, well, how we could be more successful in the future. And the second element of attention is one which is very much looked at by the government, and we are very happy about that for the coming period. And it is that within more or less all Polish regions, you have certain areas which are struggling, and it's mostly small and medium-sized towns which do not seem to keep up with the general pace of development, and this again is indeed something um, which should be a focus of attention for the next decade, including for support by cohesion policy.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this is just to indicate that there are a few things which are not that positive, but it is within an overall uh, huge success story.
I must come back to that, what I started my question, and you said that it was incorrect. I was actually briefed about it by one of our MEPs that is focused on budget. And he and his people told me, and they sent me also documents, out of which for me it was quite clear that this CRI fund is that of 7.4 billion euros is made up of, indeed, as we are talking, of unused funds. But they were telling me that these are funds that hadn't been allocated, not yet, but at all, that they would get lost. And actually 1.1 billion out of that money was the money that already were received as advance, and we would need to give it back to the European budget. So now
I can, if you want, I can explain to you in the smallest detail the budgetary mechanics of this. But I don't think it would be very interesting to many people. Again, I think we all benefit in Europe, and especially democracies benefit from honesty and from presenting things in an honest way. You started our exchange by referring notably to the Polish government at some point having said, we don't receive €1 from Europe, etc. This is our money anyway, and whatever. The first measures which we have proposed were not about new money under cohesion, right? This was before we put together a recovery plan and so on. So the first response was about flexibilizing so that member states could use cohesion money in a different way from what it was foreseen. And one of the measures we took, which is linked to the budgetary mechanics, is simply that we increased the liquidity which member state had, the cash flow, if you want, of cohesion policy. Now, how does cohesion policy normally work? It works with annual accounts. And every year, at some point in the year, you close the accounts, you look at how much money you have received from the EU budget, and you look at how much money you could justify, i.e., how many bills you have effectively paid. And what is happening is that every year we pay advances to member states so that they have, cash flow and so on, which then they have to justify at the end. And every year in all member states, so it is not anything specific to Poland or to any other member state, every year the accounts are closed and we see that member states have received more money than they can justify over the year. And so that part they have to reimburse. And what is happening normally is that they have to reimburse, but at the same time, we have started a new accounting year and we pay a new advance, which means that we just net these two things out. And in the end, member states do not pay back anything. They just get a then smaller part of the advance, which they normally should get. What has happened, what we have proposed and what has been agreed, which has led to these, I don't even remember, 37 billion, is it that? Yeah, and 7 billion for Poland.
7.5.
Is very simply, this is the amounts which member states had received over the previous year, which normally they should have reimbursed to the Commission. And what we proposed as a crisis fighting measure, we proposed to basically say, this year, we don't ask the money back from you, but it's cash flow. It's cash flow. So basically, it was for the benefit of member states' treasuries that they would have on their bank accounts 37 billion, which otherwise they wouldn't have had. That was the effect of that. But it is not linked to any risk of ultimately losing cohesion allocations, cohesion support, because that is, at the end of the period that you look at that.
Sorry for one more very detailed question connected to that. So the money that was redirected, let's say the 7.4, let's take.
Well, it has nothing to do with the 7.4.
Yeah, but
to be very clear, the 7.4 is basically, the Polish treasury keeping 7.4 billion of money, which came from the EU budget, which otherwise it would have had to pay back to Brussels in this annual cycle, and that's it. What is essential for redirecting money is something totally different. It is that part of your cohesion allocation in Poland has not yet been used to support one particular project, to decide to support, to commit to support to one particular project. And this is where I am telling you that, in fact, under the Polish cohesion allocation, there is more like 10 billion or so, which has not yet been committed to individual projects, and therefore which can be redirected.
So a question following up on that. So let's say it's 10 billion. 10 billion that we have had allocated for cohesion. But for example, we use the flexibility and we redirect it for challenges connected to coronavirus pandemic. Is there any of the mechanism we're talking about, or is there any other that can reimburse our cohesion policy hole that has been created by reallocation of these funds? So we had 10 billion for cohesion. It's not spent on cohesion anymore. Will this hole of 10 billion be somehow reimbursed? I'm using inverted commas because why to reimburse? Maybe it's not a good name, but is there European Union mechanism to mend this hole?
Well, let's imagine just a concrete situation. Let's imagine indeed that in the end, under the present period, Poland will have used 10 billion euros under cohesion for the three main areas which I have described. Yeah. So for equipment for the health sector, for supporting SMEs so that they don't go bankrupt. We call that working capital. You just give state aid to SMEs so that they can survive, and to support the labor market to avoid people getting fired by the state, basically taking over part of the wage cost of these workers. Let's assume, indeed. So this would mean, yes, I agree that 10 billion would have been taken away from possibly building some infrastructure, or, well, in the broader sense, yeah, it could be like wastewater treatment plants, or parts of motorways, or railways, or broadband connections, which would not have been financed because of this redirection. Now, on that, I have two elements to contribute. The first one is that this additional money I have talked about, which we have proposed for cohesion policy, could fill the gap. Um, so I'm not saying the whole gap, because as I said, of these 55 billion, the share for Poland will not be that big. But at least it could compensate to a certain extent, and therefore what had initially been planned in terms of infrastructure or others could still, to a certain degree, happen. And the second point is that for what could not be done, clearly it would mean a postponement to the next period. But let's not forget, the next period starts in 2021, hopefully, if the decisions are made on that, which means that these projects would not really have to wait much. It would be for decisions which could be taken already from 2021 to allocate new cohesion funding from the next period to those infrastructure projects. So I don't think that this is very disruptive altogether to the long-term objectives of cohesion policy and the support to catching up. And I would also say that when we talk about these crisis measures, to avoid SMEs to go bankrupt, to avoid people from being excluded from the labor market, in fact, we are working towards cohesion. We are working towards a better recovery and a quicker rebound. So it is not as if it were, money which would really have been used for a totally different purpose from ultimately economic and social cohesion.
We have been talking really long, but I have to ask two more questions, and I will sum them up so that you can answer all at once.
By yes or no?
No, you can try. So there is one about conditionality, because it's a hot topic in Poland, and there are two types of conditionality are interesting, especially interesting for us. So eco responsibility conditionality, and the second, rule of law conditionality. And this third question is about mayors. So Visegrad Group countries, mayors of the capital cities, they sent an open letter to European Commission and to member states, and one of their major wishes is the EU should provide direct funding for emission reduction projects at city level, so EU city agreements. And how do you see that cooperation with straight directly with cities? So conditionality and the EU-CT cooperation.
Yeah. Well, let me start with the rule of law conditionality, because this is one which is related to the values which are underpinning the European Union, and to which all member states, when they have joined the European Union, have subscribed. And let me mention to you very concretely why this is not just an an ideal, an abstract notion, the rule of law. It is something very very concrete, in fact. I guess we all agree that for spending EU money, basic rules have to be respected. And in cohesion policy, a lot of the spending happens through public procurement. Meaning, you are for public works, for instance, you have a public authority which says, I want this road, or I want, I already mentioned a few examples, whatever public infrastructure to be realized, and I am asking who can do this at the lowest, at the best conditions and at the lowest price. Now, what can happen in such public procurement contracts is that the bidding process somehow is skewed, because a person on the side of the public authority would know a person on the side of bidding companies. This is called conflict of interest, and collusion, if such things happen. And this, of course, is illegal, and must be fought against. But let's assume that such things happen, and that then one of the companies which would not have received the contract goes to court and wants redress, wants justice, and wants the contract to be annulled. And let's think now 1 minute that the court which would have to rule on this might also be under influence, might not be independent. What guarantees then do European taxpayers have that the rules will be enforced, the rules will be upheld? This is what I think everyone has to realize. It is that national judicial systems are in fact also European judicial systems, because national courts, they judge on the correct application or not of European rules. They are not alone in doing that, because sometimes cases can go up to the European court, but it's the absolute minority of cases. Most cases are handled by national courts, which are also applying European law. And Europeans need to have confidence in all national judicial systems that they will be correctly applying European rules. And for the European budget, it is essential, because this is what can give them the assurance that the money will be spent correctly. The money which comes from all European countries and all European taxpayers. And we are responsible towards all of them. And Poland, when Poland spends European money, is responsible towards all of them. So this is why rule of law, also specifically in the case of the EU budget, not only in the case of the EU budget, but also specifically in the case of the EU budget, is essential. So we have proposed that if there were serious deficiencies in matters of rule of law, which would put at risk the correct implementation of the EU budget in one member state, that one could indeed suspend EU funds to that member state until the situation is corrected. This is part of the debates and negotiations now between the member states to find an agreement on the future EU budget. And certainly on our side, we will continue to insist on seeing this rule of law conditionality introduced. On
Yeah,
you
may I
called it,
just one
yeah.
sub question? So when you decide, when European Union decides that Poland is not acting in line with the rule of law, and when we have our budget plan, for example, 63 billion euros out of the recovery instrument, what proportion of that money would we get? How to measure it? How the rule of law conditionality would apply in practice in terms of percentage of
Well,
the
today I cannot tell you. There is also a principle of law which is very simple, which is that all measures have to respect the principle of proportionality. So it depends on the gravity of the situation. So you cannot say up front, it's 5%, it's 10%, it's whatever. And on top of it, the mechanisms which we have when it comes to the EU budget are always mechanisms which try to, in fact, encourage to exit, to resolve the problem, meaning that the first level of sanction or measures is normally suspension. It is not annulment of what the EU has committed financially to do for a single member state. It is suspending the benefit, giving some time to resolve the problem, and if the problem is resolved, there would be no net sanction in the end. We would resume things. And it is only if really things are not redressed that there is in the end as ultimate as ultima ratio, as ultimate logic, that there can be loss of funds.
green conditionality.
Yes, on to green conditionality. On green conditionality, I think that one needs to distinguish different types. And let me start with the basic type which we have under cohesion policy. We call these enabling conditions, but it is a form of conditionality. And basically what we say is that cohesion spending has to be consistent and support some basic national strategies which have been developed in the context of EU regulations. When it comes to climate policy, notably, member states have to develop so-called national energy and climate plans, which are plans on how they want to develop their energy systems, how they want to develop renewables, how they want to go about energy efficiency gains um, between now and 2030. So these are long-term plans. And of course, they are very relevant for cohesion policy, relevant strategic underpinnings for cohesion policy spending, which then can contribute to achieving, to realize these strategies. So this is the kind of conditionality, which is the basic conditionality under cohesion policy. Then let me take the example of an instrument we have not yet spoken about, which is very surprising
Yeah.
because it's an extremely important one for Poland, the so-called Just Transition Fund.
Yes.
How could you forget?
I haven't. I just didn't want to focus on another mechanism.
Ah, well, you see, the EU budget is too rich for Poland. That's the problem.
I don't think so.
The Just Transition Fund is a new instrument which we have proposed as part of the future EU budget, which is meant to help territories in Europe, not member states as such, but territories in Europe which would face particular challenges to adjust to a carbon neutral world by 2050. And here we have two types of territories. One is one which is very much present in Poland, which is territories which are extracting fossil fuels, which should not anymore be part of the energy mix in the medium to long term. And in the case of Poland, obviously coal mines. These activities should, in order to achieve our climate goals, end at some point in the future, to be determined at which point exactly, but should end at some point. So we know that all the economic activities which are linked to these mines and all the jobs which are linked to these mines will one day not exist anymore. And so for these territories and regions, what we propose through the Just Transition Fund is to try to anticipate on these changes in order to provide new opportunities so that new jobs can be created in different economic sectors, and so that the economic and social transition is a smooth one rather than having an economic depression at local level, a real economic shock, structural economic shock due to mine closures. And in fact, some mine closures have already happened in Poland, as you know better than me, over the past 2 decades. And some of the areas where this happened are areas which today have serious social difficulties and have unemployment levels which are much higher than the national average, which is a demonstration that this has not been absorbed. So this is the aim of the Just Transition Fund. Now, what conditionality should we attach to that? Well, very simply, what we suggest is to say that only territories which would, over the coming decade, when that money would be spent, when the support would be there, only those territories which during that period embark on some transition, so some reduction in the production of the coal mines, for instance, if you take the example of coal mines, or for that other type of region which are very strong emitters of CO2 because they have heavy industry, steel, cement, petrochemicals, fertilizers, etc. These are very high emitters of CO2, and they also need to find a way to decarbonize their production processes. So if there is no commitment to indeed make progress of that type over the coming decade, we would say you should not then receive support, which is meant to be a support to help the transition and to help compensate for that for that transition. So that is a second layer, if you want, of green conditionality. And then top layer of green conditionality, and this is part and parcel of these negotiations on the future EU budget. One conditionality is being discussed to allow access to support from the Just Transition Fund, which now would represent, according to our latest proposal, as part of the recovery plan, 40 billion euros on its own for specific territories. So very high concentration of support over the coming 7 years, out of which 8 billion for Poland, 20%, we think legitimate because Poland has, for instance, half of the workforce which today is working in coal mines in Europe. So there is a strong concentration of that challenge in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
So the top conditionality which is being discussed today is that, in fact, part or all of that support would be conditional on the member state committing to the 2050 target of climate neutrality, which Poland today is the only member state not having subscribed to yet. So in terms of green conditionalities, I think this is what I could tell you.
So the last one I mentioned was about EU direct cooperation and support,
Yes,
transmission limiting with cities.
yes. We have seen this this proposal by the V4 capitals, and again, to describe things honestly, these proposals, we believe, are the reflection of certain fears by these four capitals. As it happens, these four capitals are led by political majorities which are different from the political majorities of the national governments of the V4 countries. And these four capitals fear that they would be excluded from cohesion funding by decisions of their national governments, which are of a different political color. We are not particularly happy by the emergence of these fears because it gives the impression that cohesion support and its use could be politicized, which it should not be. Determining where cohesion is spent within a member state should clearly not be guided by whatever political color of the majority in different parts of the member states. So this in itself is not a happy development, and I would certainly hope that when we discuss the next programming period, that these fears will be put to rest, and that indeed, because national capitals are important for the economic development, if you look at the at the economic structure, uh, even of Poland, but much more so of Czechia, of Slovakia, of Hungary, you see that the capital is the locomotive for economic development of the whole country. Prague, if you look at the relative prosperity of Prague, the economic value which is created in Prague and its surroundings, if you look at Bratislava, if you look at Budapest, it's the same phenomenon everywhere. You have a huge discrepancy between the capital city in terms of statistics and the rest of the country. Much more than in Poland. But also in Poland, Warsaw is of course a very important locomotive. But Poland at least also have some other growth poles next to Warsaw. So clearly, if we care, as we do through cohesion policy, about the proper catching up of those member states, we should also ensure that cohesion policy plays not the same role as in poor areas of those member states, but plays a sufficient role to support the driving force of the capital cities. And we hope that indeed this will be taken care of as part of the future program structures in each of the V4 countries. When it comes to direct funding and direct funding decisions, cohesion policy is not, all to the contrary, based on that approach. The approach is in fact decentralized, with member states and within member states also, as much as it makes sense, in a decentralized way in the regions. Decision making is as close as possible to the ground, and certainly not in Brussels. So under cohesion policy, I cannot really imagine such a change of paradigm where suddenly we would be deciding on projects from Brussels, even if it is only in capital cities. I don't think it would make any sense. What we need to seek, as I said, is rather that under cohesion policy, there would be meaningful programs which would be managed by cities themselves. And this we have proposed, the city dimension, the urban dimension, we have proposed to go one step further and to reinforce it under the next cohesion policy. So it would be about empowering, in fact, the cities themselves, for them to have means and to be able to make decisions. And I am very happy that they focus in their suggestion um, uh, on climate action and on greening their cities, because indeed a lot of what needs to be done should be done in cities. Cities can be very efficient ecosystems, and therefore a lot of gains in terms of energy efficiency overall are to be reaped by action at city level. What we do have in other instruments through the EU budget is some centralized Brussels-based decision making, but there it is rather, for instance, in the research program that we would have such decision making, and also as part of that program we would have some city-specific parts. But it is related to research, so it is not about very concrete projects of, a new tram line or something like that, which rather belongs to cohesion policy. So to bring it back in one word, what we wish to see is sufficiently meaningful programs also in capital cities, in order to green them, and where they would be making the decisions um, on the green projects which they want to implement.
Wow, thank you for this sufficiently meaningful and important, exclusive, comprehensive lecture of 1.5 hours. So
Yeah.
our guest today was Marc Lemaître, Director General for Regional and Urban Policy at the European Commission. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure for me, and let me express all my warm greetings to Poland and to the Polish population, and express also my hope and confidence that the future will demonstrate that Poland and Europe are a successful love story.
I hope that too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.